Desert Sanctuary with Karl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion, or we want to be contemplative, or simply ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to welcome you to our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that resonate with our fellow friends and seekers here in the desert.
Our hope is that you will find life for your body, soul, and spirit.
And now, here is our show. Before we get started with today's guests, let's check in with Karl and JD.
Hey, welcome back to Joey and JD, Karl and Jordan. Whatever you want to call us, as the dad joke goes, call us anything but late for dinner, right? Welcome back, JD.
That's right.
So, drag
Thank
queens,
you.
How's that for a segue? Not very coordinated. Drag queens are mom has
not the smoothest, but it is a transition nonetheless.
Yeah. It's not a good transit.
It is one though. Technically, you're doing what you're supposed to do.
Like that was a speech, not a good speech, but it was a speech.
Don't get caught up on the details. It's fine. Let's just keep it rolling.
I feel like that's what sometimes people say about the things I do. At least in my mind, I think that's my self-limiting thing. Is that's a book, not a good book, but it's good. It's a book, you know.
I mean, you've been hovering towards the top of the list for a while. I think you're doing all right. Don't get too down on yourself.
So drag queens, Mom's been watching. I think she's watched like 16 seasons.
No, just 14.
Just 14. Correction.
Just 14. Not six. I'm not that ridiculous, okay? This is 14, all
Just
right?
14 seasons
14
and all the All-Star episodes.
And 6 seasons of the All-Star. Okay,
Yeah.
let's get the numbers
And
right,
I rewatched
people.
it twice with the commentary on, but it's not 16, please.
So somewhere near 150 episodes is what she's watched. And I watch them with her. And sometimes I get into it, but sometimes it's just like, that's too much. But I am trying to understand the drag queen thing. And, you know, when you start looking at it, you look back and we've kind of, in the United States at least, always had some sort of drag queen, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's Bob Hope, all those guys, you know, dressed in drag at times.
I mean, even like the current, like high level, like, okay, so one of the biggest conservative YouTubers is named Steven Crowder, and that guy loves to dress up in drag. Yeah. I mean, Rudy Giuliani, okay, a conservative icon for a while until he started bleeding black hair dye, he's famously dressed in drag numerous times.
Right.
But now it's not acceptable because the culture war decided it's not.
Yeah. Powder puff football in high school. You know, the guys dressed up as cheerleaders.
I did powder puff. I dressed, yeah.
The question is, did you like it?
Stop.
I was a little bit embarrassed at first, but I like being silly and I like making people laugh, so it was fun, I think.
Yeah, one of the things I like about RuPaul's drag show, is that drag race, is
Race. It is a race.
in every season they're helping the queens deal with their trauma from being gay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not all of them are gay. Some of them are trans and things like that. But RuPaul goes out of her way to help them, you know, deal with their shit, you know, and to heal from that and talk about it. And so I think it's great. I think it's entertaining to watch, which is what they want. You know, they're entertainers. It's what they naturally feel they want to do, and I think it's fine. You know,
That's the other thing is that it is just an entertainment, and I think that is a distinction for people that don't know, and I think it's easy, especially for people who don't pay a lot of attention to the LGBTQ sphere, is that it really depends. A person who does drag is not necessarily they're not necessarily gay, not necessarily trans.
Right.
A lot of times they identify still as a man, but they do their performances in drag, or vice versa. There are drag kings as well. There was a famous one about a Taiwanese drag king recently.
There was one
it's not necessarily a trans thing.
Yeah, there was one in a recent season. I think it was season 14, then maybe 13. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But he was a heterosexual man, but he loves dressing in drag, and he was on RuPaul's Drag Race. So
yeah, people like performing. It doesn't
for sure.
It's not necessarily. That's the other thing, is that it like, as we've people who actually are paying attention have learned, a lot of these, like, drag queen story hours and things, it's not like a sexual thing.
No,
it's just about a performance thing. And let's go back to Shakespearean times. Women were literally not allowed to perform.
Right.
All of it was done in drag.
Right.
Exactly.
Does that mean that
Right.
all those people were gay or transgender or whatever? No, of course not. But the problem is that it takes more than half of a brain to understand the complexities of these things, and that's where a lot of Americans fall short, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think most of it boils down to we need somebody to hate, and if we can do that, then we can be, like we talked about in the last episode, we can be Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene, as long as we have someone to hate. As long as we can say all the Democrats are pedophiles, which is obviously not true, but
it's also hilarious. I mean, that point, I wanted to say this earlier, but it's that point is hilarious about the pedophiles, because let's look at how many Republicans are on Jeffrey Epstein's flight logs. Let's talk about people like Jim Jordan's, who helped cover up a pedophilia scandal at his university in the wrestling program. Let's talk about former Speaker of the House Devin Hester. Devin Hester was literally a pedophile, like full-on pedophile, Republican Speaker of the House. So maybe we need to think about how maybe the Republicans actually are, to use a Shakespearean phrase again, the lady doth protest too much.
Yeah, Lauren Boebert's husband has exposed himself to teenagers. Also a
good point.
And that,
I don't think it counts at a bowling alley, though. If you expose yourself to like a 12-year-old at a bowling alley, I think that's a free speech zone.
I'm sure there's an exception. Probably, she didn't have her gun with her or something. I don't know. It's something like that.
Well, the other thing that's interesting about that too is that those same Republicans in Republican states are also lowering the age of consent, also making it legal for 30, 40, 50-year-olds to marry 14, 15, 16-year-olds. So they're just trying to make it legal. They're trying to make pedophilia legal, and then they can say, we're not pedophiles. I mean, she's over 13. Let's be honest.
Right.
I'm only 45. That's not bad, right?
Yeah, that's...
And now back to the Desert Sanctuary podcast with Karl and Laura Forehand. Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. We're glad that you're with us today. My name is Laura Forehand. I'm here with Karl Forehand, and in for another great guest and great interview today. Before we get started, do you have anything you need to share with the listening audience?
Well, there's some things I could share, probably lots of things I could, but mostly I just wanted to tell everybody that we are on YouTube. We keep restoring the videos to YouTube. We never really keep the
visual part
of it. We just kind of record the audio and put a picture up. But there's over 100 videos there now, and so it would help if people would like and subscribe to that. Also, go check out our book, The Diner.
Your book, The Diner.
My book, The Diner. It's doing okay. I think we had a really slow start on it because I published it myself this time, and
I think it's doing okay though.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to tell, but positive progress. It moves, We're about to 10 reviews finally.
Yeah, well, there you go. Hey,
It's going. It's just started really slow.
yeah, that's all right though.
But the people that have been reading it have read it in like a
Mhm.
day. They're reading it fast. That tells me it's interesting. It keeps their attention and
Right.
so on. So
Yeah.
I hope people enjoy it. Writing fiction has been the funnest thing for me that I never would have imagined would be that fun, but it's just been an adventure.
Sorry, I had a little grammar moment there.
You did.
Funnest as a word. The most fun.
Most funnest.
Sorry.
More funnier.
You can say whatever you want. I apologize. I just, the teacher
okay.
came out in me for a second.
That's okay. On the diner, the editor changed so many things that it broke Google Docs. So
Congratulations.
I'm used to
I guess.
that, and I depend on people that are editor-like in my life, so
Yeah.
it doesn't hurt my feelings at all. I know I can't talk so good,
That's all right.
but that's not really what we're here for today. We want to interview Zack today, right?
Yeah. So Zack Hunt has spent the last decade writing about the interplay of faith and politics in the public sphere of his blog, Substack, and Patheos, as well as contributing articles to multiple publications. He's also made appearances in Rolling Stone, the Boston Globe, Huffington Post, and various other media outlets. He is the author of Unraptured, How End Times Theology Gets It Wrong, and Godbreathed, which is what it really means for the Bible to be divinely inspired. So that sounds like a really impressive lineup, Hunt. Zack, we're glad that you're here with us today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
All right, good. So we don't always know our guests very well at all, and we don't know you very well this morning. But I wanted to know, before we ask anything else, before I forget to ask it, are the billboards real?
They are. They actually end today, but there will be an article in the Tennessean, which is the local paper around here, tomorrow. Should go live, according to the journalist that interviewed me. So yeah, no, they're very real. They have been up on Interstate 65, just south of downtown, near the Armory Drive exit. But I think they're still up as of today, and then they'll end tomorrow.
So since that's probably what caught my attention first and attracted me to your story and the book and so on. So if you would start with that, explain what we're talking about with those billboards, and then can you tell us just your story in your own words in as much detail as you want to?
Sure. So the billboards came about through just basic, brainstorming, marketing ideas. As a writer yourself, it's hard to, rise above the noise or get your name out there and get people to kind of pay attention. So we're trying to think outside the box, because, again, as you know, writers, the marketing now is completely on the writer, or mostly on the writer, unless you have some, huge platform. So we were trying to think of ideas that might be, provocative and get people, hopefully talking, start conversation, that sort of thing, and landed on the billboards. It went through various different itinerations, but the basic idea was to take something that I grew up seeing a lot in the South and still do, are these, Jesus themed billboards up and down the interstate. Some of them mundanes, a lot of them pro-life. And a lot of them telling you you're going to hell if you don't do, this, that, or the other. Mm-hmm. And so we were like, well, what if we took that concept and the or practice, I guess, and then also the practice of, if you ever go to a concert or big event here in town, but I'm sure everywhere, a lot of times you have protesters, Christian fundamentalists like the IFB you were mentioning before, and they've got those list of Bible verses explaining why everybody's sin is sending them to hell. So the idea is, what if we took that concept again and kind of flipped it on its head? And so we had a bunch of different ideas or statements that we wanted to put up on billboard, and it actually turned out to be a really challenging process to get through their legal board or their legal advisor. I think that we just happened to luck out and run into someone who was particularly conservative and did not like, some of the ideas that we had to say, because they host billboards of the other political spectrum, all over town. And so it definitely seemed like, what we were saying was not acceptable. to this particular person. But anyway, the guy that I was working with that sold them to me was really helpful when we finally got these up, and I liked how they kind of formed the message of the book of just like not the message of the book, but a message of the book of, it's okay to admit when the Bible is wrong, because the Bible was written by people, not God, and you're not going to hell for thinking that, because it's just sort of a matter of fact. And then we put, stuff for finding the book. There's a website people can go to, godbreathedbook.com, to, find out more about those billboards. But, so far, the response, has been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, I certainly have a few trolls, on the internet who like explain to me why I'm going to hell or was wrong. But even some of that has led into productive conversations with some of those folks. And, it's helped me reach out beyond my niche of even progressive Christianity to get, some of my, agnostic and even atheist followers, intrigued in reading a book about the Bible that they wouldn't otherwise read, because they, really liked what I had to say with the campaign. So it's been good. I'm anxious, to see how the article comes out tomorrow, though, and see what sort of reception it gets.
So what's an example of one of those billboards? I don't have them right in front of me.
Sure. Yeah. So there's three of them. One of them says, it's okay to admit when the Bible is wrong, just that. And then underneath, I use Bible verses to point to it again, reappropriating the proof texting. With that one, I'm trying to forget. I can't remember which passage I used offhand.
It's okay.
It might have been from Matthew when, oh, no. It's the seen through a mirror dimly passage. It's a theme that's in the book. And, I talk about how, the book is written by people who are imperfect, and admit freely within the book that they're writing that they don't have it all figured out and are going to get it wrong sometimes. So that was one of them. Another one is God didn't write the Bible, people did. And the verse underneath that is just Romans 1:1, where Paul says it's Paul writing the letter, which is, something that should be simple and non-controversial, but people found a way to make that controversial. And then the last one just says, you are not going to hell. And, I thought it was just a nice counter to the, mini billboards, that say the opposite down here, in messages and preachers. And so, and, if we're going to be people of good news, I can definitely say that was received as good news from a lot of people who were very thankful to hear that sort of positive message instead of being, berated by evangelicals like they so often are.
I don't think we realize a lot of times how much trauma, the billboards that you're talking about, not the ones you have put up, but the other ones, we don't realize how much trauma that can cause a lot of people. Yeah. So
absolutely.
applaud you for, creating a different message out there. One that's, like you said, one that is good news.
Right. You described yourself as being in the buckle of the Bible Belt, right?
Right.
And usually that means in the center of fundamentalist evangelicals.
Right.
And we've just heard so many stories. We started out interviewing women like in September, and it went for about 3 months. And we just heard story after story after story after story of abuse and things that comes along with that. And of course, we wrote a book about thriving outside of religion, as we think it's very possible to. But we don't believe every church is toxic. We don't believe that all beliefs are toxic. Not all the Bible is toxic, but you mentioned it was written by men, and they made mistakes. They didn't know. They didn't realize yet, right?
Exactly.
So you wrote this book called Godbreathed. You put the words together, right? There's a reason for that. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah. The central quest, I guess, of the book is to try to understand what that word or what that image means. It's universally agreed upon across Christian denominations and traditions that it's making the point that Scripture is inspired. I mean, that's not up for debate. The question comes in is of what that inspiration looks like. How does that inspiration actually work? How influential is it? How all encompassing, that sort of thing. And so, God breathed is derived from the Greek word theonoustos, and that is one word. There's no like hyphen. It's just this one act of God breathing. And so part of it is I like to try to recapture the awkwardness of the original Greek. There's David Bentley Hart did a translation of the New Testament that I really like, where he went out of his way to capture that and try to not smooth over those rough edges when that are smoothed over in translation. So you can get the foreignness of the text and be reminded that you're reading something that's 2,000 years old, written by people on the other side of the world in contexts very different than your own. And then, I also really liked, or not like, for me, that hyphen makes that word look like technical and mechanical. And I wanted to move the idea of divine inspiration past this idea of being a literary mechanism or a literary magic trick, that it's not God dictating verbally, it's not God controlling the hands of the writers, but it's a much more organic, continued flowing, breathing sort of act, with a little mystery in there as well. So yeah, I'm I think most writers are picky about words and language and even commas and parentheses. And so the title was, and dropping that hyphen was part of trying to capture that bigger idea of, let's get back into what this idea really means, because it's not this technical jargon. It's a very beautiful and hopefully inspiring idea of inspiration.
Yeah. So anytime you have to say that, or anytime you try to say that means that scriptures are infallible, then you have to say that it's infallible to the point that I understand, or the point, to the point that I've defined it. It's exactly what God thought, which also happens to be exactly what I thought.
It's funny how often that happens.
Yeah, really. So, were you a pastor before, or are you a pastor now? Or
I'm not currently serving. I went to school to go into ministry, and I served as a youth pastor for several years in the United Methodist Church. But my ordination was in the Church of the Nazarene, and I still attend my local Nazarene church, and working on a book tour right now where I go around and preach and speak, and depending on the context. And so yeah, I consider myself in ministry in the sense of, this is my ministry, like writing and speaking. And I do a lot of nonprofit stuff behind the scenes. And, so it's a different type of ministry, but I'm not in full-time traditional ministry anymore.
Yeah.
So what got you to the point? What got you to this point right here where, you felt like you needed to write a book? What was there anything that happened in your journey coming up, or as a pastor, that kind of led you to this moment?
It's a really good question. I was a pastor, like I said, in Memphis for several years, and then my wife was going to med school at the same time. And so once her med school was over, she had to go do residency. And the way the residency program works is students are matched to schools based on an interview process and then ultimately a computer algorithm. And so all med students, they're going off to residency, meet together on the exact same day in March. And at the exact same time, everyone opens up an envelope and finds out, what their future is going to be. It's an exciting and kind of terrifying moment as well. And we had tried to line up the interviews and the schools that she was interested in with seminaries, divinity programs that I could go into, because I was looking at, I loved being a youth pastor, but I was looking at going back and teaching and getting my PhD, or immediately getting another master's and then doing a PhD. And so we lucked out and ended up, we thought we were going to be in Greenville, South Carolina, but we ended up in Connecticut instead. And so my wife went to UConn, and that allowed me to go to Yale Divinity, which was an incredible experience in 1,000 different ways. But it also made me realize that the PhD route wasn't actually, what I wanted to do. During this time, I was really blogging a lot, writing a lot, and starting to see, some opportunities open to create a writing career, and slowly build like speaking as well, to do the things that I was passionate about. And so like for me, one of my big passions has been trying to take what I learned in the classroom and translate that into the pew, essentially, because, there's so much good stuff that I learned in the church or learned in the academy that just gets lost in the ether for various reasons. Or if it does get taken, it's like almost just taken laterally, and it's just a lecture at church about really boring facts and words and stuff like that. I wanted to take what I had learned and thought was important and helpful to conversations, and make that not just applicable and relevant, but accessible. And so like that's a really big thing for me in Godbreathed is I think it's absolutely critical to understand that a lot of the things that we assume are essential to the Christian faith are actually not. They're rather new theologies, new inventions, new doctrines, that even if they're 500 years old and date back to the Reformation, there's still 1,500 years worth of Christianity before that. And so I really wanted to try to help folks get a sense of where the Bible actually came from, like how it was put together, how it was written, how it's been used over the centuries, but also do some church history, which is something that I know a lot of folks aren't immediately drawn to. So I tried to find ways to tell stories as often as possible, and try to tell the story about the story, and get folks a sense of where this idea of biblical inerrancy came from, but also what started it, and how fundamentalism grew up and how it slowly took over American evangelicalism. And so for me, the transition was kind of an eye-opening experience of like, hey, I can do this thing that I've always dreamed about and have been doing, in youth ministry, and take it to a bigger audience, through books, through blogs, through speaking. And so it's that I've been able to write a second book, and then, hopefully I'll get to continue to do this has been very literally a dream come true.
Mm-hmm.
We raised our three children in an evangelical church in the Bible Belt, I suppose, here in Northwest Missouri and Southeast Nebraska. But one thing that surprises us a little is we must have given them a little autonomy and allowed them to think for themselves, because they came out of that better than I thought. They do think for themselves. They seem to be more humanistic, which I think is a good thing. They care about other people. They care about the underserved and so on. Anyway, we think that's good. Trying to make this as short as I can. It's a long question, but when I went through spiritual direction training, some sisters, I've never been Catholic, but some Catholic sisters, Benedictine sisters, taught. One of them went to the board one day where we're taking the spiritual direction class, and she wrote, "None of us is right." And then she turned around and just looked at us for a while, and then she kept talking. But the question is, to you, is it important not only to strive for clarity like you're doing, but how important is it to realize, to a large extent, we don't know?
Absolutely essential. I mean, maybe the most essential thing. I mean, if we're going to even talk about faith, we have to admit, accept, whatever the word is, that faith is just that. Like, it's not fact, and so it means inherently that we don't necessarily know, we don't know, like we know that 2 + 2 is 4, or that, the earth revolves around the sun. We have faith. And so that faith is contingent on, we believe we're right, but the counter of that is that we're also acknowledging that it's just that, it's a belief. And so, I think one of the biggest challenges that the American church writ large, because that's certainly not an evangelical problem at all. I mean, it's Protestant, it's Catholic, it's Orthodox, is that we have turned doubt and admitting that we don't know and could be wrong into something akin to sin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I talk about this in the book, and, when's the last time that you heard a pastor preach a sermon or a Christian influencer on TikTok or even a book, just flat out say, I don't know, or I was wrong. We, for the past 500 years, have made such a big deal about faith and belief that it has come to the point that it's exhausted the Christian faith. And so there's no need for, discipleship. All that's needed is to believe the right things. And so you don't go to hell. And so when Christianity becomes a zero-sum game of right belief, you're going to fight off disagreement and doubt at all costs, because you think your soul literally depends on it. You can't doubt, you can't ask questions, and you certainly can't admit you're wrong in the context of salvation by right belief, because what you're saying isn't just, I was wrong about this idea. It's, no, now I'm going to hell. And so, I think as essential as, some of our beliefs are, that, and belief shapes a particular tradition, self-awareness and humility have to be, at the very core of who we are. They have to be at the very bottom of our foundation. I mean, Paul almost alludes as much in his letter to the Philippians. He quotes one of the earliest hymns in the church. And one of those, and what the early church chose to sing about in that earliest of hymns was the humility of Christ, and the calling that Christians had to follow this same radical self-emptying, self-denial, this humility. We've gotten it flipped upside down, I think, in recent generations, and have come to believe that a strong faith is, strong confidence and arrogance and a refusal, to admit wrong, or humility, is some sort of a weakness. And so, when that happens, it becomes a huge problem, because it goes way beyond just interior spirituality. I mean, it goes into the everyday life of the church and how it functions. And then you end up with people with toxic power. And when that happens, people get hurt and children get abused and all these horrible scandals happen. And not that all of it's going to be avoided, but I feel like, the first step to righting a lot of that toxic Christianity is learning to make space for admitting that we're wrong and that we don't know everything.
Can you have a church and admit that, none of us is right, like Karl said? I mean, I'm really literally throwing that question out there, because I'm thinking, that's not the churches we were a part of. It's not the standard. I mean, how do you keep people in the pews if you're going, well, I don't know, none of us is right? Yeah.
That's a great question. I would say you can't, but you could. So I think 2,000 years ago you could. I think that you see that in the early church. I think that there's absolutely, I don't want to say lines in the sand, but theological posts that they're tied to. They believe Jesus is raised from the dead. They believe that Jesus is returning, but there's a lot of space for disagreement and debate, because it's not even, there's no such thing as Christianity. It's more like Christianities plural, because you have all sorts of traditions, and within that, there's space to disagree and to doubt. 2,000 years later, no way, because churches has become so consumeristic that the expectation, or the assumption, I think, of why we think churches exist is for me to go there, get recharged spiritually, whether that's passively or actively, or some combination of both. Then I go back during my week, I get drained, and then I get refilled again. And that system doesn't work if you're not getting that spiritual high of learning something new or having some big insight. So if you went, for example, to a service that was centered around Lamentations, and you're expecting to get this, spiritual pick me up, and you're met with people lamenting death and sorrow and poverty and things like that, your pews are going to empty, because the reality is people equate Christianity and being a Christian with happiness, and joy and all those sorts of things. And those are certainly part of Christian life.
Yeah.
But if church is this religious gas station, I don't want to have to doubt that gas station is going to explode, so like there's no space for doubt. And so it's something that's desperately needed, but it's not possible unless you radically rethink what church looks like,
Right.
which I had hoped COVID would make us do.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I thought we had like so many opportunities because everyone's forced to go virtual, and what happened after it was over? The church still existed, existed without all those extra programs and things that we pour money into because we think, people won't come to church if we don't have X, Y, and Z going on 4 or 5 times a week. But like broader than that, to make space for what you're describing of a place that really welcomes questions and doubts. I mean, we have this book that we consider holy, and it starts off with a story about a guy literally wrestling with God. And if anyone in the church were to take that sort of wrestling seriously today, most of our churches would shun them or silence them or just as problematically give them answers, instead of like giving them space to continue to ask questions. So the answer is yes and no.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've been listening to stories, and we take that really seriously. They're sacred stories, and as we listen to them, we're always thankful for the privilege. But I have a lot of left brain going on, so what I'll do is kind of organize those stories into categories in my mind and look for keywords and things that repeat, and all that kind of stuff that you do, or all that kind of stuff that some of us do. Not everybody does that. Not everybody's as crazy as I am. But so when we hear these stories, things, you start to hear things that people have in common, thoughts that people have that are in common. And here's what I noticed. We call it being out in the desert. Okay. So when people are out in the desert, when they're questioning, they're outside of religion, sort of, maybe not totally. And when I notice the things that they say and the things that are helping them succeed, here's the 2 things that we've noticed most that helps people succeed in their journey and their quest and their questioning is this. Number 1, they said, Karl, I went inside and I learned to trust myself. Can you relate to that at all? Does that resonate with you at all? Does it make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest shift in my personal, spirituality, but also like theology is trying to intentionally not just make space, but really begin with self-reflection. Some of this comes not from the theology background, but from my training as a historian. When you take an intro to history or intro to being a historian class, one of the things they try to disabuse you of immediately is the idea that you're going to uncover this objective history. It doesn't exist. He said the reality is that we all have our biases, conscious and unconscious, our particular contexts, the limitations of our knowledge, our whatever, our identity in whatever way. All these things bear on our interpretations of history because that's what they are. When I come across a set of documents, I can transcribe them and just leave them. But if I want to give them any context, if I want to tell the story, I have to make decisions: what I'm going to include, what I'm not going to include, what I'm going to emphasize, what I'm going to de-emphasize. And so those things are inherently problematic. The problem comes in when we pretend that those things don't exist, as if we are just this clear, vessel through which history is told. And it's doubly problematic when we do that with the Bible, because when we start saying what the Bible says or the Bible is clear, then and pretend as if I'm not making a decision to take that verse out of context or to just focus on it or to ignore, counter witnesses in Scripture, as if I am just, what we're doing is essentially saying I'm the mouthpiece of God. I am speaking for God because I'm just saying what God said. I'm just his, automaton repeating, and that's just not the case. Now, you can still feel that way, but we need to, based on whatever verse you think, but we have to at least admit that this is my understanding of that verse. And that understanding might be right, it might be wrong, but when we eliminate or try to eliminate ourselves from the interpretive equation, that's when things like marginalization and oppression and exclusion happen immediately in the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
All sorts of abuses of power become sanctified.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think for me it was agreeing within myself that, like I said, that I can trust myself that this is the way to do it. That I have an intuition for a reason. And mine's not as good as Laura's, but sometimes it's pretty good. And we can learn to trust ourselves, but also we can develop that. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." That it's there. There's something there that we should be using more often.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you like best about the book? What's your favorite thing that came out of writing the book?
I don't know if favorite is the right word, but fascinating, if I can go with that. I wanted to try to give an accurate representation of the modern position of biblical inerrancy, what they're basing the argument on, how they're formulating the argument. So, I wanted to hear from them directly, so to speak. And so I bought a book edited by John MacArthur. It's called Inerrancy, and that's some subtitle. And it's just a collection of essays from various fundamentalists. And what was fascinating to see, one, like there's definitely a spectrum of folks when it comes to biblical inerrancy. There's what you would assume, the absolute perfectionist, you can't question it. And then there's people who will acknowledge that, like, Paul didn't write all of the letters, of the New Testament. But there was some really creative stuff along the way that I found, and particularly in that book, where one attempt to describe the mystery of divine inspiration is that God doesn't verbally dictate the Bible. God doesn't physically take over the hand of the writers or internally tell them what to say, but rather God had micromanaged their entire lives of the biblical writers in such a way that they were influenced in the exact sort of context on the exact sort of days with the exact same, sort of people they needed to come to this exact same conclusion. I thought that was admittedly creative, way to think about it. A difference without a distinction without a difference compared to, dictation. But one thing that really struck me was the history of how the Southern Baptist Convention swung right. Because we think of them as being this inherently conservative denomination, and they are. They were established on their very firm and very conservative belief that slavery was ordained by God and should be defended. Something which they did not recant until, I think, 1996. So took them a little bit to figure out the clarity of Scripture on that one. But what was really interesting, they were more moderate 30 or 40 years ago, before the rise of the moral majority and things like that. The things like abortion were not, a big point of contention for folks in the Southern Baptist Convention. But there's a guy named R.C. Sproul, who's a big biblical inerrantist theologian in that conservative reform camp. And some of his buddies got together in 1972 and formulated what they called the Chicago Statement, which is essentially their version of a creed affirming biblical inerrancy. But then they take it a step further and try to figure out how to get this fundamentalist message out. And so what they start doing is getting, some of them are the people at the top already, but working with the people at the top of their annual convention meetings to hire presidents of the seminaries who agree with them on biblical inerrancy. So then once those presidents were installed, then those presidents chose to hire professors who also agreed with them. And so once those professors are installed, then they're teaching, dozens, hundreds of students every year. And then all of a sudden you've got a denomination filled with pastors that are all believing and taught the way that R.C. Sproul and his fundamentalist friends think. But they described it themselves, and it was a point of pride, this sort of how these backdoor machinations. And so it was fascinating to see them just lay out their game plan of how they twisted the church to, form it into their own image. But then also equally bizarre that they were proud of that. And that there was, to go back to what we were just saying, no self-awareness of your own role, in what was going on.
So speaking of billboards, I usually ask everybody, what would you put on your billboards? And we didn't give you any advanced questions. We just like it. We like it better when it's off the cuff and honest. And so, there's some things you put on your billboards to market your book, and to get people's attention. But if you could, to all those seekers and those people that are still asking questions out there, what is it that you would want to put on that billboard that everybody in the world could see? And why?
God is love, and nothing that is unloving is from God.
That's interesting. I think that's really good. Do we have to then all have the same definition of love?
I'm getting way technical in my head.
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw a wrench in the conversation.
No.
I'm
So
just curious.
I'm thinking, well, one, yes, to have, like, in the sense of to have a conversation, you have to have agreed upon definitions,
Sure.
Sure. But if we're talking about, like, in sexuality terms, then I no, God, I have a very encompassing view of love. And one of the things that I get frustrated with in the church when we talk about love is the limitations of the English language. Because when you look at the Bible is written in Greek. And so every time we see love, we're seeing half a dozen different words that have all been translated into love, but it's different types of love. There's from the Philadelphia kind of love of brother, to the erotic, sort of love of eros. And so we flatten that in English into just love. And so what ends up, I think, doing is making a lot of these conversations that we have about actually fulfilling the command to love your neighbor incredibly difficult, and confusing, because, when a lot of us think of love now, we think of love in the sense of, warm, fuzzy feelings towards whoever. Maybe they're romantic, maybe they're familial, but it's this positive, sort of thing. But loving your neighbor can be getting angry that your Black neighbors are being killed by police at a disproportionate rate, right? It's not loving your neighbor can again be angry because your LGBT neighbors are being, persecuted. And so, I think that we have to, if we're ever going to talk about love, particularly in the context of the Bible, then we have to admit that maybe we're wrong about something that we think that we understand. In this case, love, because the Bible's definition of love is deep and wide, as they
right.
School.
It's a lot broader than our probably own understanding of it. Right. Yeah. Thank you for entertaining that question, because I didn't mean to throw a wrench in anything, but
no, not at all.
So how can people get in touch with you if they want to know more about your work and your books and your writing in general? How can people touch base with you?
That's a great question. So the my kind of launching pad now is zackhunt.net. The godbreathedbook.com that's on the billboard actually just takes you to a page on the website. But that's kind of got my old blogs and stuff. It's got contact forms. I'm doing a speaking tour now with the Godbreathed book, so people can contact me there. And then you can follow me on Facebook. It's the same. I have the same social handle on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and that's at Zack Hunt. But there's 2 A's in Zack because some jerk took the way I spell my own name.
This has been a really good and enlightening, and just, I don't know, I've really enjoyed this conversation. So really appreciate you being on our podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I sincerely appreciate it.
Yeah. It could have been difficult because we don't know each other really at all, but most times I think if we come in open, it goes great and it works out. So we appreciate you being on. The book again is Godbreathed. It's all one word. Check that out. Support that. I really sometimes want to just beg people, be it a book publisher, book writer. I want to say, just read it. Yeah. So I'm trying to figure out what it's going to say before you read it, and just go read it. We try to pre-read as much as we can, but if you're waiting on me to tell you, well, this is a great book, or because I liked it, you should like it. Again, we're defeating all that purpose that we just talked about. But for all of you out there listening, we are thankful that you join in, that you take on this responsibility of listening to sacred stories. And so we appreciate you dropping by. As always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
you are seen,
you are heard,
and you are loved.